The small town of Asheville, nestled in the heart of the Appalachian Mountains, had always been a place where history felt alive, where every weathered building and winding road seemed to whisper stories of the families who had carved out lives in these rugged hills generations ago. Dr. Michael Brennan had moved to Asheville 3 years earlier to take a position as curator of the Mountain Heritage Museum, a modest institution housed in a converted tobacco warehouse that held one of the most comprehensive collections of Appalachian photographs and artifacts in the region. Michael had grown up in Boston, far from these mountains, but he had always been drawn to the stories of rural America, fascinated by the resilience and ingenuity of people who had built communities in isolated places with limited resources. His work at the museum involved cataloging thousands of photographs that documented daily life in the Appalachians from the 1850s through the early 20th century, images that showed families on their front porches, children working in fields, and communities gathering for church services and social events. Each photograph was a precious record of a world that had largely vanished, replaced by modern development and the exodus of young people seeking opportunities in cities far from the mountains of their birth. Michael approached his work with a combination of scholarly rigor and genuine affection for the people whose faces stared out at him from faded prints and glass plate negatives. He spent his days in the museum's climate-controlled archive room, carefully examining each photograph for signs of deterioration, recording detailed descriptions of the subjects and settings, and researching the families and locations depicted in the images. The work was painstaking and often tedious, requiring hours of cross-referencing census records, land deeds, and local histories to identify people and places that had been forgotten by all but a handful of elderly residents. Yet Michael found deep satisfaction in this detective work, in the moment when a name finally matched a face, or when a location mentioned in a diary entry corresponded to a building visible in a photograph. He believed that every person deserved to be remembered, that the lives of poor farmers and mountain families were just as worthy of historical preservation as those of presidents and industrialists. This democratic approach to history had earned him respect among local families who had donated their ancestors' photographs to the museum, trusting Michael to treat these precious heirlooms with the care and reverence they deserved. The museum had recently received a significant grant from a regional foundation to digitize its entire photographic collection, a project that would make these images accessible to researchers and descendants around the world through an online database. Michael had hired 2 assistants to help with the massive undertaking: Sarah Chen, a recent graduate with a degree in digital archiving, and Thomas Whitfield, a local man in his 60s whose family had lived in these mountains for 7 generations and who possessed an encyclopedic knowledge of Appalachian genealogy. Together, the 3 of them had established a workflow that balanced efficiency with attention to detail, carefully scanning each photograph at high resolution while recording all available information about its provenance and content. The digitization project had already yielded unexpected discoveries, as the high-resolution scans revealed details invisible to the naked eye in the original prints, from faded inscriptions on the backs of photographs to subtle expressions on faces that had been obscured by time and deterioration. Michael felt a thrill each time the scanning process uncovered something new, a reminder that even the most familiar images could still hold secrets waiting to be discovered by patient and observant eyes. On a humid afternoon in late August, Michael was working through a box of photographs that had been donated to the museum 15 years earlier by the estate of a woman named Edith Calloway, who had died at the age of 97, leaving no direct descendants. The collection consisted of several hundred photographs spanning nearly a century, from daguerreotypes of stern-faced ancestors to color snapshots from the 1960s showing family reunions and holiday gatherings. Most of the earlier photographs had been carefully labeled by Edith or her mother, with names and dates written in neat script on the backs of the prints. But some of the oldest images bore no identification at all, their subjects anonymous after more than a century of separation from the people who had known and loved them. Michael had been working through the Calloway collection for several weeks, gradually piecing together the family tree and identifying the various branches that had spread throughout the region. He had discovered that the Calloways had been among the earliest settlers in this part of the mountains, arriving in the 1790s and establishing a farm in a remote valley that remained difficult to access even in the present day. Near the bottom of the box, Michael found a large format photograph mounted on thick cardboard, its surface remarkably well preserved despite its obvious age. The image showed a family of 8 people posed in front of a rough-hewn log cabin, their clothing and the style of the photograph suggesting a date in the early 1890s. The family consisted of what appeared to be parents in their 40s, 4 children ranging from teenagers to a toddler, and 2 elderly individuals who were likely grandparents. They stood in a formal arrangement typical of the era, their faces solemn and their postures rigid as they endured the long exposure time required by the photographic technology of the period. The cabin behind them was substantial, with a stone chimney and a covered porch, indicating that this was a family of some means by the standards of their time and place. Michael turned the photograph over and found a notation in faded ink. Calloway family, autumn 1892, home place. He set the photograph on the scanning bed and activated the equipment, watching as the high-resolution image appeared on his computer screen, ready to be examined in detail that the original photographer could never have imagined possible. Sarah was the first to notice something unusual about the photograph as she worked on adjusting the digital file's contrast and exposure to compensate for fading that had occurred over the decades. She called Michael over to her workstation, her voice carrying a note of uncertainty that immediately caught his attention. As he leaned over her shoulder to look at the screen, Sarah pointed to an area in the background of the image, just visible through one of the cabin's windows. At normal resolution, the window appeared to show nothing but darkness, the interior of the cabin invisible due to the limitations of the camera's exposure settings and the bright outdoor light that had illuminated the family. However, as Sarah increased the brightness and contrast of that specific area, a shape began to emerge from the darkness, gradually resolving into what appeared to be a human figure standing inside the cabin and looking out through the window at the family being photographed. The figure was indistinct, its features obscured by the poor lighting and the distance from the camera. But its presence was undeniable once you knew where to look and how to adjust the image to make it visible. Michael felt a familiar excitement mixed with caution as he studied the figure in the window. His first instinct was to assume a rational explanation. Perhaps another family member had been inside the cabin during the photograph session, someone who had not been included in the formal portrait for reasons that might never be known. However, as he examined the image more closely, several details troubled him. The figure appeared to be positioned very close to the window, as if deliberately watching the scene outside, and its posture suggested an odd quality that Michael could not quite articulate, something about the way it stood that seemed unnatural or wrong. Moreover, the notation on the back of the photograph had specifically identified this as the Calloway family, with no mention of anyone else being present, and the careful composition of the image suggested that the photographer had intended to capture all the family members in a single formal portrait. Michael asked Sarah to create several versions of the image with different enhancement settings, hoping that additional processing might reveal more details about the mysterious figure or provide clues to its identity. Over the next hour, Michael and Sarah experimented with various digital enhancement techniques, adjusting brightness, contrast, and sharpness to bring out every possible detail in the window area. Thomas joined them, bringing his knowledge of local history and family connections to bear on the mystery. As they worked, the figure became increasingly clear, and what they saw made all 3 of them fall silent with a mixture of fascination and unease. The figure appeared to be wearing clothing that was distinctly different from what the family members in the foreground wore, darker and more formal, almost like mourning attire. Its face remained frustratingly unclear, but the overall impression was of someone tall and thin, standing perfectly still in a way that suggested they had been aware of the camera and had deliberately positioned themselves to be visible through the window. Thomas pointed out that the window was quite small and positioned fairly high on the cabin wall, meaning that the figure would have had to be standing on something to be visible at that height, or alternatively, would have had to be unusually tall, perhaps well over 6 feet. Michael decided that they needed to research the Calloway family more thoroughly to determine who might have been present at the home place in autumn 1892 and why someone would have been inside the cabin during the family portrait session. He pulled out the genealogical files that Thomas had compiled on the major families of the region and began tracing the Calloway lineage, looking for any information that might explain the presence of an additional person not included in the formal photograph. The family tree showed that in 1892, The Calloway household would have consisted of James Calloway and his wife Martha, their 4 children, and James's elderly parents who had retired from active farming but still lived on the property. That accounted for the 8 people visible in the photograph, matching the notation on the back that identified it as the complete family. Michael found no record of any servants, hired hands, or extended family members who might have been living at the home place during that period, though he acknowledged that such individuals might not have been documented in official records if they were temporary residents or distant relations. Thomas suggested that they should try to locate the actual cabin where the photograph had been taken, reasoning that visiting the site might provide additional context or clues about the mysterious figure. He explained that the Calloway home place had remained in the family until the 1950s, when the last residents had moved to town and the property had been sold to a timber company. However, Thomas believed that the cabin itself might still be standing, as these old log structures were remarkably durable and the remote location would have protected it from development. Michael agreed that a site visit was warranted, and they began planning an expedition to the valley where the Calloway family had lived for over 150 years. Sarah volunteered to bring portable scanning equipment so they could photograph the cabin from the same angle as the 1892 image, hoping that comparing the 2 photographs might reveal something about the figure in the window. As they made their preparations, Michael could not shake a growing sense of unease about what they might discover, a feeling that the figure in the window represented something more significant and more troubling than a simple case of mistaken identity or incomplete historical documentation. The journey to the old Calloway home place took most of a Saturday morning, as the valley where the cabin stood was accessible only by a rough dirt road that wound through dense forest and crossed several streams that had washed out sections of the track. Thomas drove his 4-wheel drive truck with the confidence of someone who had navigated these mountain roads his entire life, while Michael and Sarah held on as the vehicle bounced over rocks and through deep ruts. The forest around them was thick with oak, maple, and hickory trees, their canopy so dense that little sunlight reached the forest floor, creating a perpetual twilight, even at midday. Thomas explained that this valley had been one of the last areas in the region to be settled, its remoteness and difficult terrain deterring all but the most determined pioneers. The Calloways had chosen this location precisely because of its isolation, seeking to establish a self-sufficient homestead far from the interference of government authorities and the social pressures of more populated areas. For generations, the family had lived here in relative solitude, venturing to town only a few times a year to sell crops and purchase supplies they could not produce themselves. After nearly 2 hours of driving, they reached a clearing where the remnants of the old Calloway farm were still visible despite decades of neglect and encroaching forest. The cabin stood at the center of the clearing, its log walls weathered to a silvery gray but still remarkably intact, a testament to the skill of the builders who had constructed it over 130 years earlier. The stone chimney rose from one end of the structure, and the covered porch that had been visible in the 1892 photograph still extended across the front, though its roof had partially collapsed and several of the support posts had rotted away. Michael felt a strange sensation as he stepped out of the truck and approached the cabin, a feeling of connection to the past that was stronger than anything he had experienced in his years of archival work. This was not just a photograph or a document, but a real place where real people had lived their lives, where children had played and meals had been cooked and stories had been told around the fireplace on cold winter nights. The weight of that history pressed on him as he walked slowly toward the cabin, his eyes scanning the structure and comparing it to the image he had memorized from the 1892 photograph. Sarah immediately began setting up her camera equipment, positioning her tripod in approximately the same location, where the original photographer would have stood based on the angle and perspective visible in the historical image. Thomas walked around the perimeter of the cabin, examining its condition and pointing out features that had changed or deteriorated over the decades. The window where they had seen the mysterious figure was still intact, its glass long since broken, but the frame solid, and the opening clearly visible in the cabin's front wall. Michael approached the window and peered inside, his eyes adjusting slowly to the darkness within. The interior of the cabin was a jumble of debris and decay, with sections of the roof having collapsed and allowed rain and snow to enter over the years. However, the basic structure of the single large room was still apparent, with the massive stone fireplace dominating one wall and the remnants of wooden furniture scattered across the floor. Michael tried to imagine where someone would have stood to be visible through the window at the height and position shown in the photograph, and he realized that the floor level inside the cabin was actually lower than the ground outside, meaning that the figure would have been standing on the main floor rather than on any kind of platform or elevation. As Sarah took multiple photographs of the cabin from various angles, Michael and Thomas entered the structure through the doorway, which had lost its door decades earlier. The interior was dim and musty, filled with the smell of rotting wood and damp earth. They moved carefully, testing each floorboard before putting their full weight on it, aware that the structure could be unstable after so many years of abandonment. Michael made his way to the window where the figure had appeared in the 1892 photograph, positioning himself in approximately the same spot and looking out at Sarah as she worked with her camera. From this vantage point, he had a clear view of the area where the Calloway family had posed, and he could easily imagine someone standing here and watching as the photographer arranged his subjects and prepared his equipment. However, the question remained: who had been standing here and why had they not been included in the family portrait? Thomas suggested that perhaps the figure had been a visitor who had arrived unexpectedly during the photograph session, someone who had remained inside out of courtesy or shyness while the family posed for their formal portrait. Michael was about to respond when he noticed something carved into the wooden window frame, marks that had been obscured by dirt and grime, but that became visible when he brushed away the accumulated debris. The carving appeared to be initials, roughly scratched into the wood with a knife or other sharp tool, EC followed by what might have been a date, though the numbers were difficult to read. Michael called Thomas over, and together they examined the carving, trying to decipher the date and determine who EC might have been. Thomas pulled out his phone and accessed the digital genealogy files he had compiled, searching for any Calloway family members with those initials who would have been alive in 1892. After several minutes of searching, he looked up with a troubled expression and told Michael that he had found a match, but that the information raised more questions than it answered. According to the records, EC stood for Eliza Calloway, who had been the eldest daughter of James and Martha Calloway. However, Eliza had died in 1891, a full year before the family photograph had been taken, which meant that she could not possibly have been the figure standing in the window when the image was captured. The discovery of Eliza Calloway's initials carved into the window frame transformed the investigation from a simple historical curiosity into something far more complex and unsettling. Michael spent the drive back to Asheville in silence, his mind racing through possible explanations for how a figure that appeared to be Eliza could have been visible in a photograph taken a year after her death. His rational mind insisted that there had to be a logical explanation. Perhaps the date of Eliza's death had been recorded incorrectly, or perhaps the photograph had been mislabeled and was actually from 1891 rather than 1892, or perhaps the figure in the window was someone else entirely, and the initials on the frame were merely a coincidence. However, each of these explanations seemed inadequate when examined closely, failing to account for all the evidence they had gathered. Back at the museum, Michael immediately began a thorough investigation of Eliza Calloway's life and death, determined to find documentation that would either confirm or refute the possibility that she had been alive when the family photograph was taken. The search led Michael deep into county records, church registries, and newspaper archives, piecing together the story of a young woman who had lived and died in the mountains over 130 years ago. Eliza had been born in 1873, making her 19 years old at the time of her death in 1891. She had been the eldest of the 4 Calloway children, and by all accounts had been a bright and capable young woman who had helped her mother manage the household and care for her younger siblings. Michael found Eliza's death certificate filed with the county clerk, a handwritten document that recorded her passing on November 3, 1891, with the cause of death listed as fever. The certificate had been signed by a local doctor who had traveled to the remote Calloway homestead to attend to Eliza during her final illness, and it included the signatures of James and Martha Calloway as witnesses. This documentation seemed definitive, leaving no room for doubt that Eliza had indeed died a full year before the family photograph was taken in autumn 1892. Yet the figure in the window remained, unexplained and inexplicable, staring out at the camera with an intensity that Michael could feel even across the gulf of more than a century. Sarah's analysis of the digital images they had captured at the cabin site provided additional troubling information. She had created a detailed comparison between the 1892 photograph and the modern images, using computer software to match the angles and perspectives precisely. The comparison revealed that the window where the figure had appeared was positioned in such a way that anyone standing inside the cabin at floor level would be visible from the chest up, exactly as the figure appeared in the historical photograph. Moreover, Sarah had measured the height of the window frame and calculated that the figure would have been approximately 5 feet 6 inches tall, which, according to the limited biographical information Michael had found about Eliza Calloway, matched her recorded height almost exactly. These technical details made it increasingly difficult to dismiss the figure as a trick of light or a photographic artifact, and Michael found himself confronting the possibility that the photograph had somehow captured an image of Eliza Calloway, despite the fact that she had been dead for nearly a year when it was taken. Thomas brought a different perspective to the investigation, drawing on his deep knowledge of Appalachian culture and folklore. He explained that mountain families in the late 19th century had held complex beliefs about death and the afterlife, beliefs that blended Christian theology with older folk traditions brought from Scotland and Ireland by their ancestors. Many families believed that the spirits of the dead could linger near their former homes, particularly if they had died young or if there were unresolved matters that bound them to the physical world. Thomas shared stories he had heard from elderly relatives about photographs that seemed to show deceased family members, images that were treasured as evidence that their loved ones remained present in some form even after death. He suggested that the Calloway family might have been aware of Eliza's presence in the photograph and might even have welcomed it as a sign that she was still watching over them. This interpretation troubled Michael, who had built his career on empirical evidence and rational analysis, but he could not deny that it offered a framework for understanding why the family had apparently made no effort to explain or document the figure in the window. Michael decided that he needed to find more information about the circumstances of Eliza's death and the family's response to her passing. He returned to the newspaper archives and began searching for obituaries or death notices from November 1891, hoping to find some mention of Eliza that might provide additional context. What he discovered was a brief notice in the weekly newspaper published in the nearest town, a simple announcement that stated, "Eliza Calloway, beloved, daughter of James and Martha Calloway, had passed away after a brief illness and had been laid to rest in the family cemetery on the home place." The notice was unremarkable, except for one detail that caught Michael's attention. It mentioned that Eliza had been engaged to be married to a young man named Daniel Pritchard, and that the wedding had been planned for the spring of 1892. This information suggested that Eliza's death had not only been a personal tragedy for her family, but had also disrupted plans and expectations for the future, leaving behind unfinished business and unfulfilled dreams. Michael wondered whether this context might be relevant to understanding why Eliza's image had appeared in the photograph, whether there was some connection between her interrupted life and her apparent presence at the family gathering a year after her death. Michael's investigation into Daniel Pritchard revealed another layer of complexity to the story. Daniel had been the son of a neighboring family who lived several miles from the Calloway home place, and he had known Eliza since childhood, as their families had occasionally gathered for church services and community events. According to census records and land deeds, Daniel had inherited his family's farm after his father's death in 1890 and had been in the process of expanding the property when he became engaged to Eliza. The engagement had been announced in the summer of 1891, and by all accounts both families had been pleased with the match, seeing it as a union that would strengthen ties between two established mountain families. However, Eliza's death in November had shattered these plans, and Michael found evidence that Daniel had been devastated by the loss. A brief newspaper item from December 1891 mentioned that Daniel Pritchard had sold his farm and left the area with some sources, suggesting he had gone west to start a new life, far from the memories that haunted him in the mountains. The discovery of Daniel's departure raised new questions about the 1892 family photograph and the figure in the window. Michael wondered whether the photograph had been taken as a way for the Calloway family to mark the first anniversary of Eliza's death, a formal portrait that would document the family as it existed in the aftermath of their loss. If this interpretation was correct, then the presence of Eliza's image in the window might have been intentional, a deliberate attempt to include her in the family gathering, even though she was no longer physically present. This theory was supported by the timing of the photograph, which, according to the notation on the back, had been taken in autumn 1892, almost exactly 1 year after Eliza's death. Michael shared this hypothesis with Sarah and Thomas, and they agreed that it offered a plausible explanation for why the family had commissioned a formal photograph at that particular time. However, it still did not explain how Eliza's image had actually appeared in the window, whether through some photographic technique that the family had arranged with the photographer or through some other means that defied conventional explanation. Michael decided to research the photographer who had taken the image, hoping to learn more about the technical capabilities and artistic practices of photographers working in rural Appalachia in the 1890s. The photograph bore no studio mark or photographer's signature, which was not unusual for images taken in remote areas where itinerant photographers traveled from farm to farm offering their services. However, Thomas remembered hearing stories about a photographer named Augustus Blackwell who had worked throughout the region during that period, known for his willingness to travel to isolated homesteads and for his skill in creating formal family portraits. Michael searched for information about Blackwell and eventually found a brief biographical sketch in a regional history book that described him as a talented but eccentric photographer who had developed a reputation for producing images that seemed to capture more than what was visible to the naked eye. The book included several examples of Blackwell's work, and Michael was struck by the quality and composition of the photographs, which showed a sophisticated understanding of light and shadow that was unusual for the time and place. The biographical sketch mentioned that Blackwell had died in 1895 at the age of 42, and that his photographic equipment and glass plate negatives had been dispersed after his death, with some materials ending up in private collections and others simply lost or destroyed. Michael realized that if Blackwell had indeed been the photographer who took the Calloway family portrait, then the original glass plate negative might still exist somewhere, possibly in a collection that had never been properly catalogued or examined. He began reaching out to other museums and historical societies in the region, inquiring about any photographic materials that might have come from Augustus Blackwell's studio. The search was tedious and often frustrating, as many institutions had incomplete records of their holdings, and some had never properly inventoried materials donated decades earlier. However, after several weeks of persistent inquiry, Michael received a response from a small historical society in a neighboring county that reported having a box of glass plate negatives that had been donated in the 1960s and that were believed to have come from a 19th century photographer's studio. Michael made arrangements to visit the historical society and examine the glass plate negatives, bringing Sarah along to help with the technical aspects of evaluating the materials. The society's archive was housed in the basement of an old courthouse, a cramped and poorly lit space that made Michael grateful for the climate-controlled facilities at his own museum. The box of negatives had been stored on a high shelf and was covered in dust, suggesting that it had not been examined in many years. As Michael and Sarah carefully unpacked the box and began examining the plates, they found dozens of images showing families, individuals, and scenes from rural life in the 1890s. The quality of the work was exceptional, confirming that these negatives had been created by a skilled photographer who understood his craft. Near the bottom of the box, Michael found a plate that made his heart race. It showed the Calloway family posed in front of their cabin, the same image he had been studying for weeks. However, this was the original negative, and examining it under proper lighting revealed details that had been lost or obscured in the paper print that had survived in the Calloway family collection. The glass plate negative was in remarkable condition considering its age, the emulsion still firmly adhered to the glass and the image crisp and clear when held up to the light. Sarah immediately set up her portable scanning equipment and began the process of creating a high-resolution digital file from the negative, a procedure that would capture every detail preserved in the original exposure. As the scan progressed and the image appeared on the laptop screen, Michael leaned in close, his eyes fixed on the window where the mysterious figure had appeared in the paper print. The negative confirmed what they had already suspected. The figure was present in the original exposure, not added later through manipulation or double exposure. Moreover, the higher quality of the negative revealed details that had been invisible in the paper print, including what appeared to be facial features that were now discernible despite the darkness of the cabin interior. Sarah used enhancement software to brighten and sharpen the window area, and as she did, the figure became increasingly clear, showing a young woman with dark hair pulled back from her face, wearing what appeared to be a high-necked dress typical of the period. Michael asked Sarah to create a detailed enlargement of the figure's face, and when she did, they both fell silent as they studied the image on the screen. The face showed a young woman who appeared to be in her late teens or early 20s, her expression serious, and her eyes seeming to look directly at the camera with an intensity that was almost unsettling. The image quality was not sufficient to make a definitive identification based on facial features alone, but the overall appearance was consistent with what Michael had learned about Eliza Calloway, a young woman of the appropriate age, with dark hair and delicate features. Sarah pointed out something else that Michael had not noticed. The figure appeared to be holding something in her hands, an object that was partially visible at the bottom edge of the window frame. They enhanced that area of the image and discovered that the object appeared to be a book, or perhaps a small framed photograph, though the details were too unclear to determine exactly what it was. This discovery added another dimension to the mystery, suggesting that the figure had been deliberately posed or positioned to be visible in the photograph, holding an object that might have had significance to the family. Thomas had remained at the museum to continue researching the Calloway family history, and when Michael called to tell him about the discoveries they had made with the glass plate negative, Thomas shared information that he had just uncovered in a collection of family letters. He had located correspondence between Martha Calloway and her sister, who lived in a neighboring county, letters that had been donated to the museum years earlier, but that had never been fully transcribed or analyzed. In a letter dated October 1892, just weeks before the family photograph was taken, Martha had written to her sister about the approaching anniversary of Eliza's death and about her continuing grief over the loss of her eldest daughter. The letter included a passage that made Michael's blood run cold. Martha wrote that she often felt Eliza's presence in the cabin, particularly near the window where Eliza had loved to sit and read, and that she took comfort in believing that her daughter was still watching over the family even though she had passed from this world. The letter went on to mention that a photographer would be visiting soon to take a family portrait, and Martha expressed hope that somehow Eliza would be included in the image, that her spirit would make itself known, so that the family would have a lasting record of her continued presence. This letter provided crucial context for understanding the photograph and suggested that Martha Calloway had not only been aware of the possibility that Eliza might appear in the image, but had actually hoped for such an occurrence. Michael realized that what he had been treating as an unexplained anomaly might actually have been an intentional attempt by the family to create a spirit photograph, a practice that had become increasingly popular in the late 19th century as families sought tangible evidence of their deceased loved ones' continued existence. Spirit photography was a controversial practice, with many photographers exposed as frauds who used double exposure and other tricks to create images that appeared to show ghosts or spirits. However, some families genuinely believed in the possibility of capturing spiritual presences on film, and they sought out photographers who claimed to have the ability to produce such images. Michael wondered whether Augustus Blackwell had been known for creating spirit photographs, and whether the Calloway family had specifically requested his services because of this reputation. Further research into Blackwell's career revealed that he had indeed developed a reputation for producing photographs that seemed to capture more than what was visible to the naked eye, though the historical record was ambiguous about whether this was due to deliberate technique or to some quality of his equipment or process that he himself did not fully understand. Michael found references to Blackwell in several letters and diaries from the period, with some writers praising his ability to create images that brought comfort to grieving families, while others dismissed him as a charlatan who exploited people's sorrow for profit. One particularly detailed account came from a minister who had known Blackwell personally and who described him as a deeply spiritual man who believed that photography could serve as a bridge between the physical and spiritual worlds. The minister wrote that Blackwell never claimed to be able to summon spirits or guarantee their appearance in photographs, but that he approached each session with an openness to whatever might manifest, creating conditions that he believed allowed spiritual presences to make themselves known if they chose to do so. Armed with this new understanding of Augustus Blackwell's approach to photography and the Calloway family's hopes for the portrait session, Michael began to see the mysterious figure in the window, not as an unexplained anomaly, but as the result of a deliberate attempt to create a memorial image that would include Eliza, despite her physical absence. However, this interpretation raised as many questions as it answered, particularly regarding the mechanism by which Eliza's image had appeared in the photograph. Michael consulted with experts in historical photography techniques, sharing the glass, plate negative and asking whether there were any known methods by which a photographer in 1892 could have created the effect visible in the Calloway family portrait. The experts confirmed that double exposure was the most common technique used to create spirit photographs, but they also noted that the Calloway image showed none of the telltale signs of double exposure, such as transparency or misalignment of elements. The figure in the window appeared to be as solid and present as the family members in the foreground, suggesting that if this was a deliberate photographic effect, it had been executed with extraordinary skill. One photography historian suggested an alternative explanation, that Blackwell might have arranged for someone to pose in the window during the exposure, creating the appearance of a figure watching the family from inside the cabin. This person would have needed to remain perfectly still during the long exposure time required by the photographic technology of the era, and they would have been positioned in such deep shadow that their features would be barely visible in the final image. Michael found this explanation plausible from a technical standpoint, but it raised the question of who would have posed as Eliza and why the family would have wanted such a deception. Moreover, the figure's resemblance to descriptions of Eliza and the fact that it appeared to be holding an object suggested a level of planning and detail that seemed inconsistent with a simple photographic trick. Michael decided that he needed to find more information about what the Calloway family had believed about the photograph and whether they had considered the figure in the window to be a genuine manifestation of Eliza's spirit or a symbolic representation created through photographic technique. The search for answers led Michael to contact descendants of the Calloway family who might have inherited stories or documents related to the 1892 photograph. Through genealogical research and outreach to local historical societies, he eventually connected with a woman named Rebecca Calloway Morrison, who lived in a nearby state and who identified herself as a great-great-granddaughter of James and Martha Calloway. Rebecca was intrigued by Michael's research and invited him to visit her home to examine family materials that had been passed down through the generations. When Michael arrived at Rebecca's house the following week, she led him to a spare bedroom that served as a repository for family history, its walls lined with photographs, and its shelves filled with boxes of letters, documents, and heirlooms. Rebecca explained that she had always been the family historian, the person who collected and preserved materials that other relatives considered old junk, and she was thrilled to finally meet someone who shared her passion for understanding the past. Among the materials, Rebecca showed Michael was a family Bible that had belonged to Martha Calloway, its pages filled with handwritten records of births, marriages, and deaths spanning several generations. The entry for Eliza's death was there, confirming the date of November 3rd, 1891, but there was also a notation that Michael had not seen in any official record. Beneath the death date, Martha had written in small, careful script that Eliza remained with us always, watching over her family with love. Rebecca also showed Michael a small leather journal that had belonged to Eliza herself, a diary covering the last 2 years of her life and ending just days before her death. Michael asked permission to examine the diary, and Rebecca agreed, saying that she had read it many times and had always been moved by Eliza's intelligence and sensitivity. As Michael carefully turned the fragile pages, he found entries describing Eliza's daily life, her hopes for her upcoming marriage to Daniel Pritchard, and her deep attachment to her family and to the mountain home where she had spent her entire life. The final entries in Eliza's diary were particularly poignant, written during the illness that would ultimately claim her life. Eliza described her symptoms with clinical detachment, noting the fever and weakness that made it increasingly difficult for her to carry out her usual tasks. However, she also wrote about her fear of leaving her family, particularly her younger siblings, who still needed her guidance and care. In an entry dated October 30th, 1891, just 4 days before her death, Eliza wrote that she had asked her mother to promise that the family would have a portrait made on the first anniversary of her passing, and that somehow she would find a way to be present for that portrait, to show her family that death had not truly separated them. This entry provided the final piece of evidence Michael needed to understand the 1892 photograph. It had been created in direct response to Eliza's dying wish, and the figure in the window represented either a genuine spiritual manifestation or a carefully orchestrated attempt by the family and photographer to fulfill that wish through photographic means. Either way, the image had served its intended purpose, providing comfort to a grieving family and creating a lasting record of their belief that love could transcend the boundary between life and death. Michael returned to Asheville with copies of Eliza's diary and Martha's Bible, his mind filled with the story that had emerged from months of research and investigation. He now understood that the Calloway family photograph was not simply a historical curiosity, but a deeply meaningful artifact that reflected the beliefs, hopes, and grief of a mountain family confronting loss in an era when death was an ever-present reality. He decided that this story needed to be shared with a broader audience, both to honor the Calloway family and to contribute to scholarly understanding of how 19th century Americans used photography to cope with mortality and to maintain connections with deceased loved ones. Michael proposed to the museum board that they create a special exhibition centered on the Calloway photograph, using it as a focal point for exploring themes of family, memory, and the cultural history of spirit photography in Appalachia. The board approved the proposal enthusiastically, recognizing that the exhibition would attract significant public interest and would showcase the museum's role in uncovering and preserving important historical narratives. Over the next 6 months, Michael and his team worked to develop the exhibition, which they titled Presence and Absence: The Calloway Family and the Art of Remembrance. The exhibition would feature the original 1892 photograph alongside the glass plate negative, enhanced digital images showing the figure in the window, and extensive contextual materials including Eliza's diary, Martha's letters, and information about Augustus Blackwell and the practice of spirit photography. Michael also commissioned a detailed analysis of the photograph by forensic imaging experts, hoping to provide visitors with the most complete possible understanding of how the image had been created. The experts conducted extensive testing using techniques that had not been available during Michael's initial investigation, including spectral analysis and three-dimensional modeling of the scene. Their conclusion was both fascinating and frustrating. They could find no evidence of photographic manipulation or double exposure, but they also could not definitively explain how the figure had appeared in the window. The image remained, in their professional opinion, an authentic mystery that defied easy categorization. As word of the upcoming exhibition spread through academic and public history circles, Michael began receiving inquiries from journalists, documentary filmmakers, and other researchers who wanted to learn more about the Calloway photograph and the story behind it. He gave numerous interviews, always careful to present the evidence objectively and to acknowledge the multiple possible interpretations of what the photograph showed. Some interviewers wanted him to declare definitively whether he believed the figure in the window was a genuine spirit or a photographic trick, but Michael refused to be pinned down, arguing that the significance of the image lay not in resolving that question, but in understanding what the photograph had meant to the Calloway family and how it reflected broader cultural attitudes toward death and remembrance. This nuanced approach earned him respect from academic colleagues, while also making the story accessible to general audiences who were fascinated by the mystery without needing a definitive answer. The exhibition opened in October, timed to coincide with the anniversary of Eliza's death, and the creation of the photograph and the response exceeded all expectations. Hundreds of people attended the opening reception, including Rebecca Calloway Morrison and several other Calloway descendants who had traveled from across the country to see their family's story presented in this public forum. Local and regional media covered the exhibition extensively, and within weeks it had attracted visitors from throughout the United States and even from other countries. Many visitors were drawn by the mystery of the figure in the window, but Michael was gratified to see that most people spent significant time reading the contextual materials and engaging with the broader themes of family, loss, and memory that the exhibition explored. The museum set up a comment book where visitors could share their reactions, and the entries revealed how deeply the Calloway story resonated with people who had experienced their own losses and who found comfort in the idea that love could persist beyond death. Not everyone responded positively to the exhibition. Michael received critical letters from some academics who argued that by presenting the photograph without definitively debunking it as a hoax, he was giving credence to supernatural beliefs and undermining the museum's educational mission. Others criticized him from the opposite direction, arguing that his emphasis on historical context and photographic technique showed insufficient respect for the spiritual dimensions of the image and the genuine beliefs of the Calloway family. A few skeptics organized a protest outside the museum, carrying signs that accused Michael of promoting pseudoscience and exploiting public credulity for profit. Michael responded to these criticisms thoughtfully, acknowledging the legitimate concerns while defending his approach as appropriate for a historical mystery that could not be resolved through available evidence. He pointed out that the exhibition clearly presented multiple interpretations and encouraged visitors to draw their own conclusions, and that this open-ended approach was more honest and more educational than pretending to have certainty where none existed. The controversy, while uncomfortable, ultimately increased public interest in the exhibition and sparked valuable conversations about the relationship between history, science, and belief. As the exhibition continued its successful run, Michael found himself reflecting on how the investigation had changed his understanding of his work as a historian and curator. He had begun the project with a straightforward goal of cataloging and digitizing historical photographs, approaching each image as a factual record of past events and people. The Calloway photograph had forced him to confront the limitations of that approach, revealing that photographs could be many things. Simultaneously, factual records, artistic creations, expressions of belief and hope, and artifacts whose meaning changed depending on who viewed them and what questions they brought to the viewing. Michael realized that his role was not simply to determine what was objectively true about historical images, but to explore the full range of meanings they had held for the people who created and cherished them. This more expansive understanding of historical work felt both liberating and daunting, opening up new possibilities for research, while also requiring greater humility about the limits of what could be known with certainty. The exhibition also had unexpected personal consequences for Michael. He received a letter from a woman named Catherine Brennan, who had seen media coverage of the exhibition and who believed she might be distantly related to Michael's family. Catherine explained that her branch of the Brennan family had lived in Appalachia for several generations before moving to the Midwest in the early 20th century, and she wondered whether Michael's interest in mountain history might be connected to family roots he was unaware of. Intrigued, Michael began researching his own genealogy, a project he had never undertaken despite spending his career studying other people's family histories. What he discovered astonished him. His great-great-grandmother had been born in the North Carolina mountains and had grown up in a community just 20 miles from where the Calloway family had lived. Michael had always assumed his family had no connection to Appalachia, but the genealogical evidence revealed that his passion for mountain history might have deeper roots than he had realized, a connection to place and people that had persisted across generations, even as his family had moved away and lost conscious memory of their origins. This personal discovery added new dimensions to Michael's relationship with the Calloway photograph and the story it told. He began to see his work not just as professional research, but as a kind of homecoming, a return to a landscape and a way of life that his ancestors had known intimately. He made several more trips to the old Calloway home place, sometimes alone, sitting on the porch of the abandoned cabin and trying to imagine what life had been like for the families who had carved out existences in these remote valleys. On one of these visits, he brought a copy of the 1892 photograph and positioned himself in the same spot where Augustus Blackwell had set up his camera over 130 years earlier. As he looked at the cabin and compared it to the image in his hands, Michael felt a profound sense of connection, not just to the Calloway family, but to all the people who had lived and died in these mountains, whose stories had been forgotten or reduced to a few lines in official records. He understood that his work was about more than preserving photographs. It was about honoring the full humanity of people whose lives had been shaped by hardship and isolation, but who had nevertheless created meaning, beauty, and love in circumstances that modern Americans could barely imagine. The success of the Callaway exhibition led to new opportunities for Michael and the museum. They received additional funding to expand the digitization project and to create more exhibitions, exploring different aspects of Appalachian history and culture. Michael was invited to speak at conferences and to contribute articles to academic journals, sharing both the specific findings about the Callaway photograph and the broader methodological insights he had gained about how to approach historical mysteries that resisted simple explanation. He began collaborating with researchers in other fields, including anthropologists studying belief systems and psychologists investigating how people process grief and loss. These interdisciplinary conversations enriched his understanding of the Callaway story and helped him see connections between the specific case he had investigated and broader patterns in human experience across cultures and time periods. Michael felt that he had found his true calling, not just as a curator of objects, but as a storyteller who could bring the past to life in ways that resonated with contemporary audiences and that honored the complexity and mystery of human existence. Rebecca Callaway Morrison became a close friend and collaborator, working with Michael to ensure that the Callaway family story was told with accuracy and respect. She shared additional family materials that helped fill in details about the lives of James, Martha, and their children in the years following Eliza's death and the creation of the photograph. Michael learned that the family had kept the photograph in a place of honor in their home for decades, and that it had been passed down through the generations as a treasured heirloom. Rebecca told him that her grandmother, who had been born in the 1920s and had known some of Eliza's younger siblings in their old age, had always spoken of the photograph with reverence, describing it as proof that love was stronger than death. This oral tradition, preserved through 4 generations, gave Michael confidence that his interpretation of the photograph's significance was consistent with how the family itself had understood it. He felt honored to have been entrusted with telling this story and grateful that his work had helped bring recognition to a family whose experiences reflected the struggles and triumphs of countless other mountain families whose stories had never been recorded or remembered. 5 years after the discovery of the figure in the Callaway family photograph, Michael stood in the museum's archive room surrounded by thousands of images that had been digitized and catalogued through the project that the Callaway case had helped to fund and inspire. The collection had grown substantially, with families throughout the region donating photographs and documents after seeing the respectful and thorough way the museum had handled the Callaway materials. Michael had personally processed hundreds of these donations, and each one had revealed stories of resilience, love, loss, and hope that enriched his understanding of Appalachian history and of human experience more broadly. The Callaway photograph remained the most famous and most studied image in the collection, but Michael had come to see it as representative of a much larger truth, that every photograph, every document, every artifact held stories that deserved to be uncovered and shared, and that the work of historians was to approach these materials with curiosity, humility, and respect for the people whose lives they documented. The question of what the figure in the window actually represented had never been definitively resolved, and Michael had made peace with that ambiguity. He had come to believe that the photograph's power lay precisely in its resistance to simple explanation, in the way it invited viewers to confront their own beliefs about the nature of reality and the possibility of connection between the living and the dead. Some visitors to the exhibition remained convinced that the figure was a genuine spirit manifestation, while others saw it as an elaborate photographic trick or a case of pareidolia, where the human mind perceived a face in random shadows. Michael's own view had evolved over the years. He no longer felt the need to choose between these interpretations, recognizing that the photograph could be many things simultaneously and that its meaning depended as much on what viewers brought to it as on what was objectively present in the image. This acceptance of mystery and multiplicity of meaning had become central to his approach to historical work, allowing him to explore questions that had no definitive answers while still maintaining scholarly rigor and respect for evidence. The Callaway exhibition had traveled to several other museums after its initial run in Asheville, reaching audiences throughout the Southeast and beyond. At each venue, the photograph had sparked conversations about memory, loss, and the ways that families create meaning in the face of death. Michael had received hundreds of letters and emails from people who had been moved by the exhibition, many sharing their own stories of loss and their own experiences with photographs or other objects that seemed to maintain connections with deceased loved ones. These communications had reinforced Michael's belief that the Calloway story touched on something universal in human experience, a need to believe that death does not represent absolute ending and that love can persist beyond the boundaries of physical existence. He had incorporated some of these contemporary stories into later versions of the exhibition, showing how the themes explored in the Calloway photograph remained relevant more than a century after it was created. Michael had also maintained his connection to the physical place where the photograph had been taken, visiting the old Calloway home place several times each year, and documenting how the site changed with the seasons and the years. The cabin had continued to deteriorate despite his efforts to interest preservation organizations in stabilizing the structure, and he knew that within another decade or two it would likely collapse entirely, returning to the earth from which its logs had been hewn. This inevitable decay saddened him, but it also felt appropriate somehow, a reminder that all physical things were temporary and that the real preservation work happened through documentation, storytelling, and memory. He had created an extensive photographic record of the cabin and its surroundings, and he had worked with local schools to bring students to the site so that a new generation could connect with the history that had unfolded there. On his most recent visit, Michael had brought Rebecca Calloway Morrison and several other family descendants, and together they had held a small ceremony honoring Eliza and all the Calloway family members who had lived and died in that remote valley. As Michael prepared to close the archive room for the evening, he took one last look at the digital image of the Calloway photograph displayed on his computer screen. The figure in the window stared back at him as it had on that first day when Sarah had noticed something unusual in the background of what had seemed like an ordinary family portrait. Michael thought about Eliza Calloway. Dead at 19, her life cut short before she could marry, or have children, or experience most of what the world had to offer. He thought about Martha Calloway, grieving the loss of her eldest daughter, but finding comfort in the belief that Eliza remained present in some form, watching over the family she had loved. He thought about Augustus Blackwell, the photographer who had created this mysterious image through means that might never be fully understood. And he thought about all the other people whose stories were preserved in the thousands of photographs surrounding him, ordinary people who had lived extraordinary lives in circumstances of hardship and isolation, but who had nevertheless created beauty and meaning and love. Michael felt profound gratitude for the work that allowed him to spend his days with these stories, to serve as a bridge between past and present, and to honor the lives of people who might otherwise have been forgotten entirely. The Calloway photograph had taught him that history was not just about facts and dates, but about mystery and meaning, about the questions that could not be answered, and the stories that refused to be reduced to simple explanations. As he turned off the lights and locked the archive room door, Michael carried with him the image of that figure in the window, a reminder that some mysteries were meant to endure, inviting each new generation to look closely, to wonder, and to find their own meaning in the shadows of the past.